using yesterday's toolkit on today's problems never works.
Can the regulators realistically keep up with the technology?
You can see, or should be able to see, that something's going to happen. Focus on what the regulator wrote about you when they wrote it up.
You're kind of suggesting there might be some shocks coming. Stephen, I have known you for 25 years. Sorry to scare you. And I've only ever known you as a compliance professional. So you stayed in your swimming lane pretty much the whole of your career. Can you talk us through your career?
Yeah, sure, Dean. So I guess I describe myself as a recovering regulator, because where I actually started was as a baby regulator back in the 1980s, learning my craft about regulating markets, regulating individual conduct and so on, way back then. But I have indeed spent over 30 years in the compliance swim lane after that. So the bulk of my career has been inside investment banks, working on compliance, internal control, governance, and those kinds of things.
How have you witnessed the regulations changing from written record to modern messaging and voice?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because over that period of my working life of 40 some years, there has been a very significant change in the way people do business, the way people record business. When I entered the market, I was just in time to catch the last phase of most of the market transactions, certainly in the stock exchange, being done completely orally on a trading floor, and then scribbled in a notebook, and then only later put into fairly rudimentary systems, many of which were paper-based. And, that idea that my word is my bond was the way in which most business was conducted. Most business communications were oral, face-to-face, and if it was recorded anywhere, it would be initially in handwritten paper. And I think that, if you fast forward to now, we have moved to a stage in which businesses are surrounded by and are built upon all sorts of business records and business communications in ways that we would certainly never have imagined back then. And I think that it impacts both the kind of records that you have available and the way in which you have to think about, well, so what are these records? Who could be interested in them, and what I have to do with them?
And can you think of any specific turning points in terms of that transition?
Well, so as you said, I'm a compliance officer, not a lawyer. But obviously there's kind of a big connection between what's happening in formal black letter law and regulation and what's happening in the practical world of compliance. And for me, a big inflection point was 20 years ago or so, when things like email were still relatively new and technology was only kind of partly there. It was starting to underpin more and more financial transactions and settlement systems, and to some extent communications between people in banking. But I sort of recall sitting up and listening when we got over here in the UK reports of a case that had happened in New York. Now, there'd been some debate for some time. Well, if you're going to go to court, what sort of records do you need? And there are all sorts of learned legal views on what constitutes records and so on. But there was this case in the US called the Zubulake case, and it was basically an employment law case. And it was so significant that even, compliance officers like me on the other side of the Atlantic started to think about what it meant. The case is really about a lady who worked for a big Swiss bank, UBS, and she later sued them for gender discrimination and retribution after she'd left their employment and so on. And the case became interesting because so you do this stuff that the lawyers call discovery, and you have to produce your documents, and the other side has to produce documents and your evidence and so on. And she came along with like 450 pages of emails. And the company in response had got 100 pages of emails. And this caused quite a stir, because the question becomes, well, look, if I've got 450 pages of emails, where are the company's records gone? Well, where are they? Are they in a hard drive somewhere? And so the court got interested in this, and it was really, the first time that we in compliance had been made to sit up and think, wow, if it really gets to a difficult situation with your regulator or, the criminal authorities or whatever, what electronic records do we got? Now, the turnout in that case was very interesting, because the court kind of said, well, if you can't produce the records UBS, then that's going to be a problem, and the court's entitled to assume that there's a reason why you can't or won't produce them, called an adverse inference. And of course, that is a risk issue for investment banks if the authorities will take that approach. And it made all of us start to think about, well, let's think about the records we keep. Is there really a difference between paper and email? And then in the years that have followed, you've seen the authorities forever prodding at that in terms of, well, okay, so you left a voice message. Have you got a copy of the voice message? Did you take a transcription of the voice message? Who's available to tell us what was in it, and where did you keep the record? And so on, and so on, and so on. And I think that, was a big inflection point.
And on that, there's a lot of talk we hear from banks around transcription. And I know a lot of entities don't want to transcribe because they then have a written record.
Yeah.
Do you think, like the Zubulake case, it's a matter of time before a judge says, okay, I get you haven't got a transcription, but I know you have a recording. Play the recording. I'm going to admit it as evidence.
As I said, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to venture a kind of legal opinion on this, but kind of practical logic with the way that we've seen this stuff evolve suggests that every time technology takes a step forward and produces material or records or machinery or something in a different format, the powers that be, naturally enough, say, well, okay, so it's not written on parchment. It's recorded or written in the form it is today. And if it's material, if it's probative to whatever we're looking at, then I want to see it. And so my assumption, since the Zubulake case filtered over here 20 years ago, has consistently been that you have to think about all forms of record in the same way. This point you raise about, in various places around the world, there's still a real distinction, technical legal distinction about, well, if you haven't reduced it to writing, don't reduce it to writing, because the discovery rules might be different about that. So, and of course, one has to take the legal advice on that. But I think it's a relatively weak protection. And it's a relatively weak protection, both because the law might look through it, but actually it's a relatively weak protection because if you don't know what's in something you have no protection against the risk. So if you have lots of records in all sorts of formats, I think that it's probably a lower risk approach to think about how you can safely look at what's in there and think about the risk profile of it.
I almost feel, as you were saying that, I was thinking back to something you said, I think on the Zubulake case, where the lady in question had 450 emails, the bank had 100 emails. Yeah. That's also a bit embarrassing, isn't it? I mean, aside from the regulatory side of it, from a brand damage point of view, it's not a good look, is it?
Well, it's not. I mean, there's an interesting thing in the detail of that case that the judge actually reprimanded the legal advisors for misguiding the bank in
On what to disclose.
terms of what records they should have and how they should disclose them. So that compounded it not being a very good look for anybody. And I think that just hoping that what you've got sitting in your records won't be a problem, or won't be subject to a claim, or won't ever be required as evidence, or doesn't contain anything that might be, I don't know, market misconduct or client abuse or something of that sort, that's a big assumption to make. And it could be that just making that assumption is itself not a very good look.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're kind of suggesting there might be some shocks coming.
Well, I think we've seen over the last 3-4 years, in particular, we've seen regulators both sides of the Atlantic increasingly looking at what I think of as the completeness of coverage problem in regulated firms. So they have been saying, okay, so how do you know which markets your people are playing in? How do you know which systems they're using? How do you track and index that? And to the extent that you know the market and the systems they're in, what records do you have? And then to the extent you have records, what are you doing with them? Are you investigating them? And we've seen very significant enforcement cases around the world over the last 2 to 3 years based pretty much around those three questions. Do you know where your people are playing in the financial markets? How do you capture and assure around that? And then what types of oversight are you doing on their activities there? And, banks collectively and brokers collectively have, written checks for $2 billion over the last 2 or 3 years, principally around those questions.
So we can imagine an ever-growing pile of data that is being captured and archived, and the regulators are clearly expecting more and more and more. So that pile's only getting bigger and bigger. Yeah. And I think what you're saying is, in essence, it's really important you know what's in there.
Yeah.
And do you know what's in there? And is it a satisfactory excuse to say to a judge, I didn't know it was in there? I mean, if you've got it, there's a sort of I know it's not written down that, well, there has to be an expectation that you're monitoring it, but you can't, that's not something that's practical with humans, right? You can't monitor every conversation that's been had.
Well, at the moment, I think one of the problems is that there is no standard approach across the industry. So if you knocked on the doors of a dozen firms, you would find pretty variant answers around. So which records do you keep, in what format, how do you track, how do you assure, how do you conduct oversight on all of those activities and those records? There is no wholly consistent practice. And I think also that the approaches that firms are taking are changing over time, but again, not consistent with each other. So it's not as though they're all heading in a single direction.
It seems to me firms have an ever-growing pile of data that they're storing and archiving, and you're suggesting, I think, that they might not know what's in there, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Yes. I think the practices between firms vary enormously. The way those practices have changed and are changing and developing over time is very variable across the industry. It's not like there's a standard practice. And I think there's, and I see this in my consultancy activities now, there's a surprisingly varied range of answers when you ask the question, so what records do you have? How do you keep them? What efforts do you make to see what's in there? And what do you do if there's stuff in there that you don't like?
Is it not the job of the regulator to set out that standard?
Well, to some extent, but the regulator, I guess quite rightly, is in the business of setting out the framework and expectations. And although some of the detail around, particularly in certain markets, for instance, the telephone calls that have got to be taped, things like that, are set down, the broader practices about how much due diligence is enough, how much surveillance of messaging, of calls, of dealer board activity is enough surveillance, that benchmark tends to be in fact set progressively by enforcement actions in which the regulator says, okay, well maybe there wasn't a clear standard, but you should have known, so we're going to set the benchmark here.
It's very subjective, isn't it?
I think the whole thing is subjective, and that's reflective of your point, that the amounts of business records data that firms now keep are truly colossal, truly varied in format, and not subject to standard practice, that it's, to be fair to the regulators, very difficult to set prescriptive levels in every case. So using a particular kind of disciplinary or enforcement case as a benchmark is quite a convenient way of doing it. I mean, again, to be fair to everybody, the regulators do say pretty fairly, look, if you do this stuff yourself, we won't do it for you. So for me as a compliance officer, it sort of throws the onus back on us to kind of say, so let's try and interrogate this stuff intelligently and think about where the risks are, and think about, questions like, are we more risky for our shareholders and our stakeholders? Are we more risky if we don't interrogate the data? Or are we, in some cases, more risky, perhaps legally, if we do interrogate and transcribe the data? And if certain rules say this type of data must be kept for X years, okay, is that like a minimum standard? Or actually, if I'm confident on it, would I want to keep it longer because it can protect me? And so on and so on. And I think sort of an active approach to those questions is a pretty important activity, subject to, I think, my subjective qualification that there's probably no right answer, but not attempting an answer isn't acceptable either.
Let's talk about technology.
Yeah.
Are the regulators embracing crypto?
I think the regulators are now evidently trying to embrace anything where they think risk that impinges on their responsibilities can be found. I mean, crypto is an interesting example because in most places around the world, it's not really a regulated product at the moment. So the regulators are looking at it and saying, yeah, but are the things in the crypto market which impinge upon risks we're worried about? And if you think about the UK, for instance, most crypto activity isn't per se regulated, but the regulator's approach tends to be, yeah, but it can affect behaviours like the risk of layering and placement in the money laundering chain. And so the money laundering regulations tend to be applied to that area. So I think it's a good illustration of a kind of a pragmatic approach by regulators who say it used to be really clear that regulated firms look like this and regulated products look like that, and we knew, exactly what we were looking at. With the changes in technology, they are very pragmatically saying, yeah, well, we know it's not quite like that, but we are going to look at the risks it constitutes, and we're going to apply some of the regulation where we think those risks exist. And that also gets you into new approaches to regulation. So if you think of a topic that you and I have discussed before, which is the Digital Operational Resiliency Act in the European Union, which of course also impinges on people outside the European Union who supply services into the European Union. That's all about saying, well, there are new operations in the financial industry that have got systemic and consumer risk impacts right across society. And some of the firms to which that act applies are not in any sense classic, kind of broker-dealers or banks, but they are part of the ecosystem which supports this whole thing. And so we're going to extend regulation outside of the classic banking broking area that MiFID covers or EMEA covers, and we're going to extend regulation out there because the risk has seeped, because the practices in the industry have seeped onto different platforms and different formats and so on.
Can the regulators realistically keep up with the technology? How do they approach that? It must be really difficult. I mean, they're not technologists. I'm imagining that they must be out hiring technologists now. But how do they keep up with this stuff?
So I think it's always been a kind of a pursuit game for regulators. It even was, 40 odd years ago when I was the regulator. It's a pursuit game in which the industry will flex, change, mutate in a particular way. That will change the risk profile, and then those charged with trying to catch the risk, either inside firms or at the regulators, will then say, okay, activity's changed, the risk profile has changed, we need to change the rules to capture, and or we need to change the sort of practices we have to mitigate that risk and to ensure that firms mitigate that risk. It's always a challenge. It was as a regulator, it is as a compliance officer, because people come into your office and they say, we've just had a brilliant product idea, and it involves using a third-party supply platform that isn't linked to any of the things that are currently in your surveillance system. That's great. That's quite a good day at the office, because it means they've actually come and told you. I mean, what quite often happens in firms is that people go off and they do this stuff, and then as the compliance officer or the risk officer, you have to go and find out where your coverage isn't, and play catch up. And I think the regulators have to do that as well. I mean, I think one thing that I would say, and this is particularly true of the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, is that they have made huge strides over recent years to be on the front foot with technology. Now, they're clearly not going to be setting the agenda, because that comes naturally out of the industry. But they have in recent years tried to create a climate in the UK in which regulated firms and others can come along and find a kind of a listening audience. And also some practical steps like their regulatory sandbox, which allows you to effectively play with product structure and play with technology and say, hey, how does this work? And you can do it in a safe space. So I think the UK regulator, in my opinion, has been as good as it gets in terms of trying to be there alongside the changes. But of course, they're never going to set the agenda. It's always going to be firms and businesses who are saying, well, let's go over here, let's go over there, I could do it this way. And it is a real challenge, both within firms for compliance officers and generally for regulators outside firms, to keep up with that. To kind of answer your implied underlying question, do regulators have a choice? I don't think regulators do have a choice, because part of their risk profile to society and government is that if they can't show that they can continue to track the risk profile, and the risk profile moves with what people do and how they do it, if they can't track that, then there's no value in them doing the stuff they used to do, because it won't be mitigating the risk profile they were set up for. So I think they don't have any choice, and I think they will continue to try to do that. Probably it gets more complicated, and it's getting very complicated now, particularly around the use of big data and artificial intelligence for product development, for product marketing, and these things that we're seeing.
Yeah, on AI, let's touch on AI. Coming back to this earlier point around the fact that we've got these big piles of data and we don't know what's in them. AI has to be a solution that I'm sure everyone's looking at and thinking about, and I imagine the regulators must be thinking about that too, and challenging firms and firms that say the technology isn't available to do that, we can't do it with humans. If I were a regulator, I'd be starting to say, are you sure?
Yeah, I think the use of AI in society generally and in the industry specifically is clearly on the rise. The regulators are aware of that, and they're starting to look globally. The regulators are starting to look at what that does to the risk profile. I think both within firms and in regulators, from some of the things that are being said, you can see that they're looking at, if you will, the two sides of the equation. Because from one point of view, AI and big data can propel an upturn in the risk profile in the industry. Getting to more people more quickly, is the product right for them, and so on. But from another point of view, I think everyone's thinking about it in terms of, well, actually, if those of us who are compliance officers, regulators, whatever, if we can harness AI, then we should be able to match the rise in risk profile with a clever harnessing of technology to mitigate some of those risks. And I mean, historically, that has been the way it's gone. You know, you'll see technology advances pushing commercially and therefore increasing the risk profile in the industry. And then regulators and compliance officers coming along and saying, well, actually, some of that technology we can use to smooth out some of those risks. So I think that is starting to happen now, with people looking at how you can use very smart technology in surveillance systems, and how you can use big data and the rapid analysis of large volumes of data to tell you things like, where am I, you know, in terms of normative comparison against other people in the industry in my risk profile. And I think that we're just kind of starting to see where that comes. And of course, the regulators will quite soon, I think, be using the same sort of data when they look at a firm and say, hey, look, you know, well, we've got access to the data too. We've got some smart tools, and we've compared you to some other firms that we've reviewed, and we don't think you're in the position you should be.
But doesn't that help move from the subjective problem to a much more objective measurement, where you can say across the industry, here's where you sit, you need to improve in these areas, and you kind of end up with a homogenized standard?
You can, and you do, and that's partly around the ability of the regulators to access or compel access to enough data if they're looking in to firms. And then it's partly around the smartness of firms in terms of, you know, what I think of as like utility pooling of data. So the industry has done great things historically in other areas of risk. If you think of credit risk, you know, the whole history of credit risk is about ever deeper pools of data about whether Stephen's going to pay his bill, or, you know, that kind of stuff. And that has become both a proprietary thing for individual firms, but more broadly, credit history and credit dynamics have become a resource for people to compare firms, you know, for the credit rating agencies to compare firms and so on. And you can see how in the future, both for regulators and firms, access to these kinds of data might be of greater value on both sides of the equation, and people might consider it like more normal to say, well, on balance, I don't mind giving a little if what I get in return is a view of the market.
Well, we've seen this actually. We've seen banks give a little bit. I know with some of the recent fines that have around failing to capture encrypted traffic. I think with WhatsApp in particular, messaging traffic. A few of the banks now have gotten away from being fined and got off from being fined and got fined zero because they were assisting the regulator. And I think actually they volunteered. They were aware that they were in breach. So there's clearly these quid pro quos happening all the time. On capture, I wonder whether there's an intermediary stage an intermediate stage where, for example, rather than the current policy of fining firms for failing to capture, are we going to see the regulator starting to fine firms more for failing to monitor and surveil what they have captured?
Well, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would be inclined to back that horse. I think it's almost unavoidable that regulators would turn their scrutiny towards okay, so we kind of know what you've got. What have you done with it? How much do you know about it? There's this great concept of latent risk. Crystallized risk is the stuff that's happened, and you've got to do something to pick it up. And it used to be that both regulators and compliance officers were entirely focused on crystallized risk because your information wasn't good enough to do anything about anything unless it had actually happened. So we were all kind of trained and focused on crystallized risk. Something's happened, right, how do we fix it? And progressively over the years, as information data processes sophistication has got better, compliance officers and regulators have kind of moved up the time curve and the process towards the point at which you can see, or should be able to see, that something's going to happen. And so I think we've seen a couple of instances over recent times in which the substance of a regulatory finding has really been around, do you know what there was a case recently I was looking at where the underlying question in the final notice that was issued was, you were sitting on this stuff and then you never asked the question until we came. And then when you answered the question, you hadn't really thought about the answer and what you knew. And then it took us as the regulator to make you really think about the data you'd got. So that really, for me, was a really important kind of moment because I can see the regulators giving people the benefit of the doubt up to a point. Okay, we're in a new world. There's far more data. There are different ways of interrogating it, but only up to a point. It's your data. It was generated by your employees. It's sitting on your systems. You didn't know that there was a likelihood of something going wrong here.
And that point to me, it's interesting because for me that point is the firm doing something and showing that it's trying. And if I'm a regulator, it would seem fair to me if I'm investigating a firm and there's a problem and maybe they've missed something, but they were doing everything that they could to try. It's just unfortunate that it got missed. It may have even been missed by some AI system, but they're at least having a go. I think. Do you think those firms will be the ones that maybe either avoid fines or mitigate those fines when they happen?
Well, it's funny. So there's always a lot of commentary in social media and amongst the law firms and so on when you have a firm that is enforced against and they show and are credited by the regulator with trying to do the right thing. And the coverage is usually about, well, they didn't get much of a discount considering, that they really did try to step up here. So I think it's less about how much money do you get knocked off the fine because the regulators use that tool very carefully, but it is rather more about the atmospherics and the relationship and the public perception. So it's my kind of thought on that is, well, if it knocks a few pounds off your fine, that's good, but focus on what the regulator wrote about you when they wrote it up, because that will tell you the temperature of the relationship going forward and the kind of subliminal messages to you as a firm and to other firms as well. So I think the dividend comes in a much softer way than a few pounds off the fine.
So if you were a Chief Compliance Officer today, given everything we've just discussed, what are the sorts of things that you'd be thinking about?
Okay. In this area of what records do you have, how do you know you've got them, and what are you doing with them, I think I would be wanting to ensure that I had got a pretty comprehensive map and understanding of where and why we held records. Is it because we're compelled to? Is it because a conscious decision has been taken? Is it because we think there's a real value to keep something better and longer than the rules require? And why? That brings you to questions of governance around, so who makes those decisions? Who's responsible for protecting the records? Who's responsible for deciding how far they're interrogated and how that gets escalated? I think I'd also then want to think about the real practical stuff, which is, okay, so most businesses today, whether it's kind of Apple or, most high street shops, the real business is done on somebody else's platform. Manufacturing industry, your Apple computer is made 3,000 miles from Apple's headquarters by a subcontracting firm on a platform loaned by somebody else, and so on. So if I was sitting in the firm and I'd answered those first questions around records, I'd then think, so what records have other people got where they're contracted to us? And how do I know they've got them? And what standards are they adhering to about like retention and protection and security and escalation and all those things? And how do I know they're adhering to those standards? That interestingly brings you back to things like the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, because that's kind of built around that. And then I would be, the biggest one of all, I'd want to be focusing on this question around what is the relative risk profile of information I've got, and I know what's in there, data I've got and I know what's in there, and of data I've got, I'm perhaps required to have, and I've never opened and I don't know what's in there. And what am I going to do about the data set that I've never opened up and I've got to sit on it?
And lastly, if you were still a Chief Compliance Officer today, given the AI tools that are available today, would you be thinking these are going to completely transform how we do this?
I would. I hope I would be forward thinking enough to see that using yesterday's toolkit on today's problems kind of never works. In the industry, no firm wants to spend more than it has to on control infrastructure, compliance, oversight, those. Of course, we kind of get that. But it's a case of balancing the risks and balancing the costs. We have, over recent years, seen enough cases which have cost a lot in terms of, treasure and reputation, for people to say, okay, was there a smarter way of knowing more easily what's in a given set of data? Was there a smarter way of interrogating it, escalating it, and so on? And, a lot of firms are still using almost no technology or really, really basic technology approaches to interrogate written records, dealer conversations, those kinds of things. And I just think if we are not going to be caught out as an industry by the advance of technology, as a compliance officer, I would be wanting to move as fast and as forward as I could up that technology agenda, because that's what actually closes the risk gap in an appropriate way.
Brilliant. Stephen, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
If you've made it this far, thank you. You got it to the end, and this is my opportunity to ask you to like and subscribe. It really helps with the algorithms on the platforms as we look to grow this channel. We've got some really interesting interviewees coming up, and you'll get notified of those as they happen. Thank you.